Good morning and welcome to Coventry Vineyard. My name is Nick, and if you're looking for a church, then we would love to help you on that journey of finding somewhere that you can call home. So do get in touch. You can email me at nick@coventryvineyard.org.uk. Now today the children are looking at the story we find in Acts 3 verses 1 to 11, and it's where Peter and John pray for someone who cannot walk and is then healed. I love this story. There's these two people who, as they went about their daily lives, looked for ways to express the love of God to those that they meet. And so the craft activity is around this story, and we'd love to see the creations in our Zoom gathering at 11:15 today. And details are in our newsletter, which goes out every Friday. The Zoom gathering is where you can connect with our wider church family and also receive prayer and ministry in smaller breakout rooms. Now, we recently asked those who are part of this church to help us make some next steps. And we'll have some details to give you next week. But one key thing that came out of this survey was that when we asked, what have you found most helpful in your discipleship? That 74% of you answered that it was life group that you felt was most helpful. Now, if you're not in a life group, then you really are missing out. Life group is where we do life together. Now, primarily, they equip each of us to live life as followers of Jesus, but they also encourage you to worship God in your everyday life. And where, as we go about our daily lives, look for ways to express the love of God to those we meet, just like Peter and John in that story. Now, life groups are based around the three commands that Jesus gave to each of his followers: to love God, to love your neighbour, and to make disciples. And these all occur in the context of community. We're not supposed to live life on our own. And healthy life groups offset the bias towards individualism that runs deep in our culture. Life groups are also one simple antidote to isolation. They are designed to help us connect with one another and become who God has called each of us to be. Life groups are really our main resource in this church for pastoral care. And these groups help us look beneath the surface of our lives, deal with our brokenness, and find healing from our past, as well as support to live in the present and face the future together. Life groups are a safe place to be vulnerable with people we can trust. Now, if you're not in a life group, we encourage you to find one that you can be at home in, where you can make authentic friendships and be supported as you navigate this journey of life. Now, as part of doing life together, we also often face grief and loss. And today, Susy speaks to us about how we can process through grief and loss in a healthy way. All of us experience the pain of grief, but how do we allow Jesus to transform our loss into life? Now over to Susy.
Good morning, everyone. This morning we're continuing our series here at Coventry Vineyard on emotional health, and today we're looking at the sensitive subject of grief and loss. Grief and loss are things I've thought about quite deeply over the years and I've experienced in different ways during the 45 years of my life to date. Just to give you a few selected examples from my own life so that you can see that this talk is very much grounded in experience rather than just being theoretical. My first sort of memorable experience of grief and loss as a child, when I had some understanding of then what it felt like and what it meant, was the death of my grandpa when I was 13. When I was 21, I experienced the suicide of my closest childhood friend. When I was 25, I moved to a completely new country, to Rwanda, to live and to work. There was a sense of adventure, a sense of excitement, but also a sense of leaving my UK life, my UK friends and family behind. A few years ago, I experienced the death of my closest friend in Rwanda from multiple sclerosis. She wasn't even 50 yet, and this is the same disease that my mother's battled for most of my life. I experienced the death of several friends, colleagues, and family members from cancer, from other diseases, as well as experiencing our goddaughter being stillborn and walking the journey of grief with her family. I've experienced the gradual loss over several years of my father due to his dementia, which is now quite advanced. He's still alive, but he no longer has the memory and the speech that he once had, and he's no longer the person that he once was. And then at the end of August this year, after 18 years of working with the same organisation, I volunteered for redundancy. A bit like my move to Rwanda, it was a sense of being the right time for new things, but also sadness at leaving behind what was familiar, some amazing colleagues, and amazing work that the organisation does. So those are a few examples from my own life of grief and loss, some of which you might be able to relate to, others perhaps not. But your grief and losses may also include other things. It may include the death of dreams such as marriage or having children. They may include the realisation that something that you thought would happen or the way you thought life might turn out is not actually the reality you're living and might never be. You may have experienced miscarriage or divorce. You may have experienced bullying and abuse that has robbed you of confidence. You may be experiencing now the loss of a normal life due to protracted illness or disability. And then on top of this, over the last 6 months, we faced COVID-19, which has brought loss on many different levels to us all. Some of us have experienced death or illness of loved ones. All of us in different ways have experienced isolation and lack of human contact. And this has been particularly hard for those people who live on their own. When we can't meet friends and family, we can't give hugs, we can't provide a shoulder to cry on. That's really hard. We've experienced the stress over the day-to-day things we can't do. Simple things like meeting a friend for coffee. Right at the height of the pandemic, the stress of not being able to find flour or toilet roll. Perhaps cancelled holidays. For us, we had to cancel a trip to Rwanda. It would have been the first time we'd gone as a family for 10 years, but that wasn't meant to be. Some of us have not been able to celebrate births and weddings and mourn deaths in the same way as usual due to the restrictions on public gatherings. We've experienced loss of control and spontaneity. Those of us in multiple person households, whether they're with people you're related to or people you're not related to, there has at times felt like a loss of space when we're all stuck together in one place during lockdown. And some of us have experienced furlough, redundancy, or trying to juggle work and childcare or virtual school at the same time. So whatever your experience of grief and loss, whether it's something very recent due to COVID, whether it's something completely not related to COVID, that's from a long time ago or more recently, grief and loss results in feelings of weariness, sadness, disappointment, anger, regret, isolation, jealousy, and ultimately pain, all of which affect our emotional health. So we're in a world where most people put on their best face in public, and also a lot of the time on social media. Particularly in the UK, we've got this British expression when responding to the "how are you?" of "I'm fine." And "I'm fine" covers a whole multitude of emotions, from "I'm barely surviving" through to "actually, yeah, life's pretty good at the moment." And whilst mental health is becoming a little bit less taboo to talk about, we still fear talking openly about grief and loss, especially as time goes on since the grief or loss event happened, as we feel that people have got an expectation that we should have got over it when it's still very real for us often. So what's God's perspective on grief and loss, and how to have a healthy emotional response? What does the Bible say, and how should we respond as people of faith? Well, I've drawn out 6 principles from the Bible around how we should respond in an emotionally healthy way. First principle is to accept that grief and loss are a standard part of the rhythm of life. We know that life has its 4 seasons: spring, summer, autumn, winter. It's something we learn in primary school. We know that these seasons come and go with regularity every year, but still we're people who generally moan when it's not summer, when the rain comes, when it gets cold, when it gets dark. We're quick to moan and forget that summer's been and that summer will come again. And the book of wisdom in the Bible, Ecclesiastes, just reminds us of this concept that in life there are rhythms, and there's a time for different things. Ecclesiastes chapter 3 verses 1 to 4 say this: "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance." This passage very much captures the fact that there's a time and season for grief and loss, for sadness, for pain. Our world is a broken world, and death and grief is a normal part of the cycle of life, not an abnormal part. Having realistic expectations that grief and loss will happen, not might happen or might be there for someone else, but they will happen to all of us, means we're more prepared and less surprised when they do happen. So that's our first principle, to expect grief and loss. The second principle is to depersonalize. Psalm 103 verse 8 says, "The Lord is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in love." Love and compassion are at the heart of the character of God. When we experience grief and loss, it's not because God is punishing us. It's the result of living in a fallen and broken world. When we experience grief and loss, we have a choice of how we frame it. When we personalize it and see ourselves as victims, we spiral into negative thinking, blaming ourselves, blaming others, or God for something that's bad that's happening to us, rather than working through grief. We doubt God's character and think that God's vindictive. I've heard people say, "God must hate me because this has happened to me, because my mum has died, because I've been made redundant." Yet that's the total opposite of what the Bible teaches us. It teaches us that God is a God of love and compassion. So that's our second principle, that we must depersonalize whatever we're going through, that it's not some kind of cosmic vindication against us. The third principle is to be honest and real with God and with others about how we feel. God created us as emotional beings. It's okay and healthy to talk about our feelings to God and to others without fear of being judged. The Bible is full of laments. You've probably heard the word lament, but what does it really mean in a faith context? I think what it means is it's about a cry to the Lord in anguish, but one that's anchored in trust. If we just look at Psalm 13 as an example of a lament, this was a psalm written by David. We don't know the full context of what he's going through, but we can see from how he expresses himself that he's full of grief, he's full of sorrow, he's struggling with sleep, he feels like he's been abandoned. This is what he says. He says, "How long, Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long must I wrestle with my thoughts and day after day have sorrow in my heart? How long will my enemy triumph over me? Look on me and answer, Lord my God. Give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And my enemy will say, I have overcome him, and my foes will rejoice when I fall. But I trust in your unfailing love. My heart rejoices in your salvation. I will sing the Lord's praise, for he has been good to me. This is an example of someone who is very much expressing their feelings, but also expressing their hope and their trust in God. Amongst our worship songs that we sing today, there are very few songs of lament. I think it's reflective of the fact that we're often scared of being honest with God about how we feel. But songs of lament show this rawness, and they show how bringing it to God can enable God to give us comfort. God wants us to bring all of our emotional pain to him. We're told to cast our cares onto him, and that he's our shepherd who promises to walk with us through the valley of the shadow of death. I remember back to my student days. I remember going to the Memorial Park several months after my closest childhood friend Sandra had died by suicide. And I remember crying out to God in my pain whilst listening to music. And I remember wondering whether life would ever feel normal again. I felt such a sense of grief, of loss, of questions, of pain. And I didn't feel like it would ever go away. And as I was talking to God about this and wrestling with it, a song came on my Walkman. For those of you who are who are young, a Walkman was an old style mobile phone that you could play music on with a tape. And I remember the words of the song. It was a song by Iona called Healing, and it said, "A time will come when the pain will go. A time will come when your love will flow. A time will come when your heart will know healing." And this was had such a sense of God giving me hope. It didn't take away that I still felt desperately sad with so many questions and really missing my friend. But there was a sense of hope and that healing would come. The thing is, if we don't express our emotions and we don't talk about how they are, we end up repressing them. And when we repress them, they come out in other ways, often impacting negatively on our physical and mental health. So instead of grieving, we get stuck, we avoid our feelings through looking at other ways of trying to drown them out. We binge watch TV, we eat too much food, we drink too much alcohol, we turn to drugs or cigarettes, we overwork just to try and blot out the pain. When actually a healthy way is to be real about how we're feeling, both with God and with others in our community. And as a community of faith, we also need to be a people who are willing to ask people how they're doing, to mention the unmentionable. One of the things that's hardest that people say about grief is when people don't acknowledge or mention it because they don't know what to say. So rather than saying, "I'm really sorry to hear your husband died or your son died or you've lost your job," people just sort of skip around the edges because it's a bit awkward. And this is particularly important to do, not just straight after the event, but months and years later, being able to ask, being able to remember the person, mention the unmentionable, so to speak. So that's the third principle, to be honest with God and with others about how you're feeling. So the fourth principle is to remember. We have a short memory, sometimes a bit like a goldfish, and we often forget history. Grief and loss have been a long part of human history, so it's really important that we do our own history lesson. Starting off with our own lives, what have we experienced in the past that can help us in the current situation? Where we've experienced grief and loss before and we've come through, how can that help us in what we're experiencing now? Then looking to our community, how can we learn from others and ask others about their own experiences with grief and loss to help learn from them? Particularly if you've experiencing grief and loss for the first real time and it feels overwhelming, talk to someone who's further on in their journey in life and find out how they've walked through that situation and what advice they can give. Also looking to wider society, just taking the example of COVID-19. For most of us, it's the first pandemic we've ever experienced. But actually, if we look through history, there have been a number of previous pandemics. Just to name a few, there's been the Black Death, the Spanish flu, and Ebola. And as a world, we've come through those pandemics to the other side. Just looking at that history is really important because it helps us sort of contextualize what we're going through, and it helps provide some hope. Some of you know that I'm married to Jermaine, who's a survivor of the Rwandan genocide. And when we went into lockdown at the beginning of COVID, his perspective was, well, I lived through a genocide and God protected me and God brought me through. The fact that God's done that for me then, he'll do that for me through COVID, whatever the difficulties we might have to face. I remember also speaking to my mum, who was housebound during COVID because of a health condition, which means she had to self-isolate. And I said, how are you doing? And she's like, well, I've lived through the war. We can live through this. It's not that difficult. And had a very sort of different perspective because she was drawing on her past experiences. And we've also got a whole range of biblical stories to draw upon. The book of Job, many of the Psalms, God's journey with the Israelites out of slavery into the promised land, all give us hope that God walks with us through difficult times and he brings us through. So that's the fourth principle, to remember. The fifth principle is to accept and embrace. Now, it's really important to say that accepting and embracing grief and loss does not mean getting over it, but instead it's about our grief and loss becoming part of who we are, shaping our character and giving us greater empathy towards others. My cousin sent me an email last week in response to a Facebook post where I'd asked people what's been their biggest loss in life and what's helped them to journey through that loss. And he reflected several years after having lost his baby son, just a week after he was born. He said that what helped him was recognizing that it doesn't get better. Nothing can bring back his son and take away the pain of that, but it does get more bearable. And that he's found a way of integrating the loss he's experienced from losing his baby son into his everyday life and decision making. We don't ever get over losing something or someone of value. This is now part of who we are, part of our experience. Grief and loss allow our character and resilience to be developed over time. They allow our suffering muscles to be stretched, ready for the next battle, because we know that grief and loss is not a one-off occurrence. There'll always be memories and pain that from time to time get triggered. And that's okay, that's human, and that's okay when it's a long time after the event. For me, just recently, as I've been working on my CV and thinking about job applications, my dad used to be the person I'd talk to about those things. He was the person who first showed me how to write a CV and write a covering letter. I've still got copies of those in my files. And yet he's not been able to help me on this journey that I'm on right now. And that brings a sense of loss and a sense of reminder of that. Different things will trigger memories of losses we've had, and that's okay. So our fifth principle is to accept and embrace. And our final principle is resurrection hope. The disciples experienced extreme grief at the cross. When Jesus was crucified, they experienced the death of a friend, the death of a teacher, the death of the leader of their movement. They were just overwhelmed with grief. Yet this was followed by Jesus' resurrection and a change in their character towards hope. And the Bible's perspective again and again, from the beginning to the end, is about following Jesus through death and resurrection. That theme is abundant in so many of the stories in the Bible. And the Bible reminds us that we're strangers and aliens in this world. This is not our home. We're travellers passing through. Whatever lands we travel through, God will be present with us and will one day bring us to our permanent home. That means we can grieve with hope. We can grieve with the expectation of things coming good in due time. We can grieve with the hope of heaven. Jesus has promised us the keys to a room in heaven that he's preparing for us when our travels here on earth end. A place where there'll be no more pain, no more suffering, no more grief or loss. At the end of the Bible, in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, it talks about God creating a new heaven and a new earth. And verses 1 to 4 of Revelation 21 say this: "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away.'" This is the promise for us that one day sorrow and sighing will flee away. This passage provides an anchor for us in the storms of life and before we get to heaven, as well as when we get to heaven. And this has been a regular theme of my weekly conversations with my incredible friend Kate. I've known Kate since my mid-20s. Jermaine, my husband's known her a few years longer, and she was the one that introduced us, and the rest is history. We then got married. So I've known Kate for many years, and Kate's battling cancer. She's got a terminal prognosis. Yet despite her physical suffering and having to lay down future dreams that short of a divine miracle she'll no longer be able to realise, she's pressing into God. She's holding fast to hope and the knowledge that God is preparing to give her keys to a room in heaven when her time on earth is done. She understands that the life of faith is about following in Jesus' footsteps and includes resurrection hope during and after pain and grief. So Kate's my inspiration. Kate's my hero. Kate's somebody I want to imitate as I walk through grief and loss in whatever form they come through the rest of my life. So that's the sixth principle: resurrection hope. So just in summary, we've looked at 6 principles of a healthy response to grief and loss. Firstly, grief and loss is part of everyday life for us all in different ways. Secondly, when we experience them, it's important to depersonalize what's happening. Thirdly, we need to have courage to share how we're feeling, both with God and with others, so that we can receive support and perspective. Fourthly, God gives us the Bible, other people, and our own life story to draw on each time we experience grief and loss. Fifthly, accepting and embracing grief and loss is a way to become more like Jesus. And finally, resurrection and the promise of heaven give us hope both now and for eternity. So in this series that we're looking at emotional health, we've been talking quite a bit about what it means to be emotionally mature. And I think when it comes to grief and loss, emotional maturity is about lamenting, but trusting God and not forgetting resurrection hope in our darkest moments. It's about being real about the pain that we're feeling, but knowing that God is good and he's going to walk with us through that pain, and that there is that promise of hope. So as I close this talk, I want to ask 3 questions. And I want you to reflect on these questions as we listen to a song in a few moments. The 3 questions are: what have you lost? How are you grieving that? And how can you be with others in grief? So we're going to play a song now called You Meet Me Here. And I want you to open your heart to God and let him meet you in whatever grief and loss you're experiencing. And then following that, we're going to share communion together and let God continue to speak to you and minister to you through communion.
Where can I go from your presence? Where can I run from your spirit? You meet me there. Spirit, you meet me there. Where can I go from your presence? Where can I hide from your spirit? You find me